Welcome to the EdUp Smart Space Podcast, where we explore the trends at the intersection of architecture, technology, and education. I'm your host, Craig Park. My guest today is my longtime friend and fellow OG technology planner, Michael Leiboff. Mike is retired now, but during his career, he was nationally recognized for his work in strategic planning for technology, for higher education, institutional, and corporate clients. Welcome, Mike.
I think I was recognized among the people in our various offices. I don't know how much more national it was beyond that. In any case, it is my pleasure to be here.
We're happy to have you. Mike, can you share a bit of your background for the audience?
I kind of have an interesting background. In college, I majored in international relations and Chinese studies. Why is that important? Because it proves that anybody can evolve into a technology planner. I began my career as a slide maker, actually, when slides were king.
35 millimeter slides for the audience.
In those days, you would print out a mechanical, which is basically typeset typing, and then cut and paste it and put it on a white background, and then take a picture of it, which would invert the background to black and the text to clear. You would then put colored gels over the clear part, and that's how you got color. We're talking about the days before computer-aided slide making. That's how I got into the business of technology. I used to make a lot of presentations for companies. So I was initially exposed to how corporations made their presentations.
I was thinking that with our perspective spanning more than 40 years of work in the industry and our interest in commenting on technology's evolution, we may be the Slater and Waldorf of the AV industry. You're going to look that one up, folks. How did you get involved in technology planning?
Well, I was selling slides. And so I made a sales call to the folks at Union Carbide on Park Avenue. At that time, I was looking to make a change. I met with the head of AV and I said, "How do I get a job like yours?" And he looked at me, he was a little perplexed. He said, "I don't really know, but I know this company that designs boardrooms." And I thought, designs boardrooms? That's architecture. Anyway, to make a long story short, I called up the company. And I got an interview. I met with a gentleman who was senior vice president there. After a few minutes of talking, he stopped and he said, "Look, there's a guy in the next room. I want you to go in and talk to him. Ask him what he does." So confusedly, I walked into the room and I introduced myself. He introduced himself. I asked him what he did. He described this process of interviewing corporate clients and finding out what kind of presentation technology they needed. I thought that was pretty cool. I said, "Oh, so that's how the technology gets into the corporate world. They hire a consultant." He said, "Yeah." And he was leaving for another job. There was a slot open, unbeknownst to me. I walked back into the SVP's office and he said, "Would you like to do that?" I said, "Well, I can't do that." And he said, "Everybody says that. You'll be able to do it." I said, "Well, anybody who thinks he's willing to take a chance on me, I'll sure give it a shot." So that's how I got hired by Hubert Wilkie Inc. and began a wonderful, thoroughly, completely, utterly unplanned career in multimedia technology consulting.
For the audience's sake, I'll tell a little side story. That was 1978, and in 1978, I graduated from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo with a degree in architecture. I had worked for that same Hubert Wilkie company in their Los Angeles office while I was in school. I had just graduated, and Hubert called me up and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I've got a couple of interviews with architects to be an architect." He said, "Well, I really liked the work you did when you were in our LA office. They liked working with you. We'd like you to think about coming to New York and work for us here." And that led to a job. I think I joined the firm maybe a month or two before you. We started going out to lunch together as two young guys in the field of learning how to be an audiovisual consultant and have been friends ever since.
That's funny. My recollection was you were always the senior guy who knew everything from the first moment. Anyway.
Yeah, but anyway, we digress. So what are the common elements that you saw spanning both corporate workplace and academic environments?
Over time, that changed. In the beginning, in the late 70s, early 80s, the corporations had lots of money, and they had a great incentive to put on effective, eye-popping presentations. In the late 70s and early 80s, the corporations had the money for presentations. They needed, for marketing purposes and for internal presentations, they had to look good. And they were able to spend an extraordinary amount of money on what was best of technology at the time. Now, keep in mind, prior to that, they were dealing with slide projectors, maybe one, maybe two, maybe three projectors working in concert. But they started to evolve towards video projection in the early 80s once the personal computer came out, and it became a tool that generated information that they needed to see. Unfortunately, the universities had very little money and little experience with sophisticated presentations. And I suspect even if they were interested in upping their game, they just didn't have the money for it because this stuff was extraordinarily expensive at the time. Now, over time, corporations continued on their journey using the sophisticated technologies, and really the universities caught up. They caught up in part because they had to be competitive in the media consumption world. Their students got something out of it, and they appreciated that it had value to add. They didn't always add the right value, and sometimes it didn't quite work out the way they wanted. We'll talk about that later. Over time, they began to spend more and more money until they got to the point where now they can be very competitive, and in some cases, they're doing cutting-edge stuff in virtual reality and things of that sort. So now they're pretty much the same.
Well, I saw the same thing, and it was interesting that we talked about this offline, that over in the late 70s and early 80s, the projector of choice was known as an overhead projector or overhead foil projector. And for the young audience, that's not this projector hanging in the ceiling. This was actually a big box that used a 8x10 transparency that you could produce on a xerographic machine and then lay on this table, and it had a light underneath it, and that light would shine through through a prism and through a lens and up on a screen. I remember even in the early 80s designing boardrooms for IBM that used overhead transparencies as their primary media. It was cheap, it was fast, they could update data pretty quickly. As you went through classrooms and lecture halls in academia, you saw that same overhead projector as the media of choice. And it really wasn't until 35 millimeter slides became a de facto new media that we saw generational change to something new. As you pointed out, in the mid 80s, we saw a video projection become available. I remember you and I going to a New York bank and showing them how they could show spreadsheets on a screen with a video projector that they could manipulate live on. And that was exciting to them.
That was Chemical Bank in the old days. They were head over heels in love with the new technology.
We've seen this transition over it is hard to admit, the 5 decades of development we've been involved in, from personal computing in the 80s to the internet of the 90s, online and distance learning in the 2000s, collaborative and team-based learning in the 2010s, and now hybrid flexible learning in the 2020, primarily due to COVID. All of that has one common element that we've been involved in, why technology planning is essential in the early stages of projects and master planning. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Traditionally, architects design facilities to meet usage requirements of their clients, and they have aesthetic priorities that they're trying to meet, both for their clients and for themselves. Multimedia technology requires adjustments and modifications, really, to the way the room will have to be designed. And it impacts the room to a huge extent. It impacts the size of the room, the shape of the room, the ceiling height of the room. It reflects the base building infrastructure. Before, architects had to worry about outlets and maybe Ethernet connection. But now they required so much more electrical base building plumbing that it impacted their architectural thinking. It took a while for them to be won over to the fact that the sooner they got us involved, the better it would be for them.
It's interesting that is a theme that continues to this day. I hear it on both sides. I hear it from clients saying, we wish we'd have called you earlier. And I hear it from AV designers and AV installers that we wish we had been called earlier. I think there's still a learning curve that goes on about why technology planning early is critical to the long-term success of a facility. You mentioned some of the other sort of related architectural aspects. You and I have talked at length about acoustics and lighting as equally important as the technology itself. Does that come into play in the success of a room?
Well, it sure does. If you think about it, in any room where people get together, they have to be able to hear the presenter. They have to be seeing what the presenter wants them to see, which is usually some sort of large display image. They need to be able to interact with each other, and they need to be able to hear each other. If there's to be any kind of interaction at all, they have to be able to see properly, and they have to originate audio and video, either for record keeping or distribution. What does all that mean? It means that the sight lines, the ceiling heights, the room shape has to be taken into consideration at the origination of the idea of a particular space. It becomes critical. The equipment requires connectivity, power, and the room has to be hospitable in terms of acoustics and lighting. You want to be able to adjust the light so that you can illuminate what you want to illuminate, which is oftentimes the presenter. Sometimes it's other things. You want to be able to control the lighting to notch it down a bit if you want to do some sort of projection or do something special that requires that the room to be less illuminated. So there's a lot that goes into consideration. And in terms of acoustics, you want to make sure that the acoustics in the environment are hospitable. That means that voices aren't bouncing off the wall and causing echoes. It also means you can't hear what's going on outside when there are jackhammers going on.
Or there's a room next door with something going on.
If you're having a really good session in a learning space, people get loud. You don't want to disturb your neighbors. So acoustics becomes a critical issue.
You know, one of the things that we were involved in back in the early days of our careers, because technology was new to the long-term strategic planning for both our corporate and institutional clients, was a real deep dive into the why they presented, what they presented, where they presented, who presented. And we did a process that was known in those days as a communication audit. I recently completed a similar exercise for a university in the Midwest, where we took a look at every one of their technology-enabled spaces that were used for teaching and met with the users and the technology support people to talk about how those rooms were working. And we found that the generations ranged. There were probably over 150 rooms, but some of those had technologies that were 7, 8, 10 years old compared to some that were brand new. I think the value of a process, and I was hoping you might describe a communication audit for educational institutions to use today.
Good planning helps plant the seeds of success in any project. When a new building is being planned or a major renovation is on the table, a broad spectrum analysis should be undertaken to get the context in which the spaces are being used. The uniqueness of learning spaces, how the spaces are integrated within the overall organizational plan for use, an analysis of initial and long-term costs, measurable goals that can be achieved and reviewed afterwards so you can see what you didn't get right. Another point worth making is many institutions with many buildings and have multiple colleges, in their planning, they need to pay attention to the context of what has come before, lessons learned. This way we don't keep making the same mistakes over and over again. And while it's true that different disciplines have different requirements, there's much to be learned. It takes extra effort in the planning to take that into consideration because you don't want to dredge through the old stuff, but you know what? The most valuable lessons are in the old stuff. And moreover, facilities can be used in different ways for different initial purposes, but they should be considered as a campus-wide research, at least on a theoretical basis, so that 20 years from now, they still have large value.
Excellent. And we talked about, the importance of being early and the importance of integrating technology. What are some of the mistakes that you've seen when technology is not planned?
Well, I'm afraid you and I have more horror stories than we can count. One of the biggest mistakes that clients make is assuming that audiovisual experts know how to meet their needs. What they don't realize, especially in academic facilities, is that pedagogy should drive everything that happens in the classroom, including the use of technology. Another mistake is taking into consideration that technology will evolve over time. People are so focused on solving the immediate problem that they don't think about tomorrow. As such, it's important to imagine the infrastructure that might be necessary to accommodate the capabilities that maybe you can't afford right now. At the time of construction, infrastructure costs pennies. It costs many dollars as a subsequent retrofit. Another common mistake is to focus on the cost of buying equipment for initial installation. That's only the beginning of an ongoing cost because these devices need to be maintained and they need to be replaced over time. Moreover, the equipment needs to be caretaken by technical specialists that may require specific skills that are not currently present. In many ways, incorporating technology is a lot like groundskeeping. Once you create it, you can't stop the ongoing process of maintaining it. Otherwise, it's going to look like hell. Although we're seeing changes in the attitudes of the younger generation, teachers typically have not been comfortable in using multimedia technology. As a result, a generation of teachers have either avoided or poorly used the capabilities that were available to them. A greater effort has to be made to facilitate the adoption of the new technology, and that requires training and perhaps more than a little nudging. And finally, an all too common mistake is not to take stock of the experience of using technology-equipped spaces. Very few, if any, institutions do a post-occupancy review of their facility. In part of the planning, they should establish specific goals, and at the end of the process, after a month or 2 or 3 or 6 months, whatever, those goals should be compared to what actually happened so that you have some way of knowing how well you succeeded and if you succeeded at all, because all too often, institutions continually make the same mistake. They do things in isolation, and nobody's comparing notes. So it's critical that some sort of after-occupancy analysis is done.
I agree. I think that's key. Can you share some examples of successful projects, ones you're proud of?
Actually, I do have a favorite, and it was a favorite for a variety of reasons. It was a project that I did for Harvard Business School in about the year 2000. It was quite exciting to be able to work with some of the best educators on the planet, and I was bowled over by their willingness to discuss things from every angle. They were just as interested in covering all the bases as I was, and they kept asking me, what are we not seeing? What are we not doing? Which I thought was really good. As a result, they were very collaborative, and that's so much better than getting short, curt answers from faculty who don't even want to be in the meeting doing the interviews, which is sad. They made the point of having the project team, the audiovisual consultants, the architects, and the other consultants, to actually watch the teaching process. As it turned out, classroom activity might be compared to a live action play where every element was choreographed, which I found shocking. Moreover, in order to ensure that the classrooms would work as expected, a mock-up was constructed out of plywood, out of an emptied pool in another building. And not only did they create the outline of the room, but they created the different elevations of the different sets of desks that were in the room as well. It was really quite accurate. The instructor workstations and student desks were constructed in a way so that, according to all things that we, the design team, knew, were just right. We thought we nailed it. There was a requirement by the school that there be 3 screens at the front of the room. And every good audiovisual technologist knows that in order for everyone to be able to see everything on all 3 screens, the screens have to be located and sized properly. As a result, I recommended that 3 screens, sized equally to meet technical requirements, be put at the front of the room. Upon entering the mock-up classroom, the instructor sensed a significant problem which resulted from the way the room was shaped and sized. The room was too wide, which I forced as a recommendation to make the screens of equal size. Surprisingly to us, and the instructors picked up on it immediately, the result was a loss of intimacy as the instructor moved around the room, facilitating discussions among the students. Remember, I said this is like theater. They knew at what point in the lecture they were going to be standing where and when they were going to write what on the board before they even walked in. We only could see that as we sat through a few classes and experienced it for ourselves. Well, I realized that my technical priorities had created a problem, and that the student-teacher dynamics, which I had not initially considered, was not working right. In the end, the center screen was fully sized, but the left and right screens were reduced in size to shorten the width of the room. Now, I did warn the faculty that they couldn't cram as much information on the material that was being shown on the left and right screens. And they thought about it for a minute and just said, yeah, we can do that. We'll make sure we put less information on it and that it'll be easy to read. This extra step was a sacrifice that they were willing to meet and be mindful of as they taught. Now, that's the best example of collaboration that I've ever had with a client.
That's great. I know in my role, I talk with clients about the importance of developing pilot spaces. That becomes part of the process of evaluating space and evaluating technology. I know you've shared with me before a project you did that you called the Gumby space. And can you tell the audience a little bit about that?
I will. You're describing a philosophy of implementation that I found out later. It's called agile planning. What that means is you tinker around with many multiple implementations of environments, but nothing is permanent. The idea is you don't spend a lot of time and money learning lessons which you can easily learn if you just mock something up and work with it for a few days or a few weeks. The idea being that you come across with lots of experience without the penalty of creating permanent solutions that require expensive renovations. The best example I can think of that describes that kind of place is work that I did at Teachers College at Columbia University. Their goal was to create an ultimate flexible environment, which I imagine to be named after a cartoon character made of clay popular in the 90s as a Gumby room. The character's name was Gumby. It's very similar to a black box theater, which is basically an empty frame with lots of ways of attaching things to things so that you can do anything within the defined environment. And that's just what they wanted to do. The ceiling was comprised of a pipe grid for which lighting, electrical outlets, network connectivity, speakers, microphones, cameras, anything you could think of could be attached. In addition, the underfloor was a raised floor. It was only raised a few inches, but it allowed the easily to pass through wires that served as both communication, electrical power, etc. Additionally, they thought about providing some extra control room functionality and back of house space, so they added more square footage to accommodate those factors. It was really a wonderful opportunity to both collaborate with a very interesting client, but to provide a space that had 100% guarantee they could do what they wanted. And it was really fun.
That's great. I've talked to several institutions recent times that have implemented that same kind of flexible test bed, and they found it extraordinarily useful in testing pedagogies and testing student and faculty involvement, whether they find the systems comfortable, and really help them work on cleaning up their user interface, making things easier to use and easier to manage as well. What key advice do you have for higher ed and K-12 leaders looking to integrate technology into their master planning process?
Well, I think the same goal that I think architects should have. Architects and clients who've worked on successful projects have an innate sensitivity to involve engineers and technology planners at the earliest moment. The reason they're sensitive to it is because all too often they come up with a gorgeous design that they're utterly and completely in love with, but it doesn't work technically. And so they avoid a certain amount of heartache on their part if they bring us in early so that we can collaborate to get to the point that we need to get to. As a result, technical, engineering, construction, aesthetics, all of those priorities can be established and integrated from the very beginning. It is that understanding which saves time and saves money in any new construction project.
Are there any resources or organizations you would recommend that institutions can tap into to keep up to date on the best practices in academic technology planning?
Actually, AVIXA is the one that I'm most familiar with.
AVIXA is the Audiovisual Integrated Experience Association. It's evolved since when it was the National Audiovisual Association into something that recognizes that the experience is as important as the technology itself. BIXI is the association that governs the infrastructure that we all use today. for IT technology that connects all the equipment. It sets the standards, it provides the certifications. NAB, the National Association of Broadcasters, is really where the whole understanding of how to produce good distance learning and connected learning happens, where they establish those standards. I think those three associations have the best resources. As we look forward, and I always conclude these programs with what comes after, what comes next, are there any game-changing innovations you see on the horizon? You shared with me recently an experience using VR, and that's been talked about a lot in education, though I'm not seeing, except in simulation learning, but AI, other emerging technologies that you think will be important to the educational facility of the future?
Well, let's talk about AI for a minute because that gets the most print. I think at this point, everyone would agree AI is a bit of a wild card and it will have an impact on almost everything and anything, and the details of which are kind of difficult to see at the moment. I've thought a little bit about it, and I think it will probably be used as a way to provide checks and balances over planning as the construction documents become created and they go through the various iterations, because I think they will be able to keep in mind all the variables and balance the equation in favor of the best solution to accommodate the most requirements. Other than that, it's anybody's guess.
I think that's a fascinating take. I had not thought about commissioning, which you just described as a process that many firms use. We establish the criteria early and then test the results against a set of criteria. AI is a perfect solution for that. It can do that analysis very quickly. What about visualization technologies like AR, VR, mixed reality? Have you seen institutions start to implement that in their class spaces?
I haven't, but I've been away from it for a bit, so it may be more extensive than one would think. If anything, what I have seen are spaces that have all four walls as visual display spaces so that you can put up, usually for smaller groups of people, so that people can walk around the room, look at the information, point to it, adjust it, and get real-time feedback about it.
Yes, computer-aided visual environments, caves, if you will. Today, with the advent of the direct view LED screens, which are effectively a visual wallpaper, it's possible to create not only the walls, but the floor and the ceiling as well. That's a technology approach that's been used for very specialized research in a variety of different market sectors, but one that now has become much more accessible to other groups to create a truly immersive experience without forcing the need for wearing specialized eyewear.
You're seeing that. I've noticed CBS News in the evening news has changed its news show format, and their weather guys are in this immersive environment. They're walking over the map, showing where it's going to snow.
And it's being used in production of motion pictures as the backdrop instead of the traditional green screen overlay, the Mandalorian spinoff that's on Disney television. All of the backdrops are done with DB LED screens, allowing them to put much greater detail. Some of us are avid science fiction readers. I told the story to a number of clients about my vision of the future classroom is the one that's in Ready Player One, where the students are sitting in a classroom, they're wearing VR headsets, but they're basically experiencing walking around Paris with the faculty all at the same time. I think that's an exciting future that I hope I see while I'm still working in the. As we close, is there any other final thoughts you would say about what education leaders should think about for their next big project?
Well, given the rate at which technology is evolving and all the things that seem to be on the horizon and that are currently in our backyard, it's very tempting to think that planning is out of your control because you can't imagine what things will be like. But that's not true. We've been doing this for a long time, and the same priorities that we saw at the beginning of our careers in the late 70s and the early 80s are still true. It's easy to be afraid of it, but there's no substitute for good, thorough, and forward-looking base building, looking at operational costs in the future, thinking about what kind of personnel you're going to need, and thinking about how managers are going to manage it. These are things that will never change. They are constants, and focusing on that will give you a leg up in any undertaking you initiate.
Spot on. Thank you, Michael. That was a wonderful first conversation for this podcast. Thank you to the audience for listening. I hope you'll join us for future episodes on the EdUp Smart Space Podcast. Check in with the EdUp Experience at edupexperience.com to see the other shows in this series. I hope you'll join us again. Follow us on Spotify and subscribe for future editions. Thank you very much. For those interested in learning more about planning for technology, I've included a link in the podcast description to an article, The EdTech Navigator, a strategic planning framework for learning spaces, that appeared in the May 2024 edition of Campus Technology. This article was inspired by my work with Mike Leiboff in our early career.